Welcome to Glowing Lantern Books. As a high school English teacher, I want my students to learn through experience, by moving, by getting hands-on instead of desk work and worksheets. So today's video is my countdown to my top 5 interactive lessons. Number 5, Survivor Circle. This activity is especially common to pair with a text like The Lord of the Flies, but it can be used for any text that relates to government. Here's how it works. Students come into the room and sit in a huge circle. I give them a scenario. They are to pretend that they were on a flight somewhere and they had to make an emergency landing in a mountainous region. No adults landed with them. The assignment is then for them to come up as a whole class a plan for how to survive for 1 year. Make sure they don't spend time figuring out how to get saved or rescued because that's not the focus of the assignment. As a class, they're to turn in one piece of paper on behalf of everybody to me by the end of the period detailing this plan. I put some prompts and questions up on the screen for students to reference and get them thinking, and then I let them go. As the facilitator, your role is truly to stay out of the conversation. Be sure to take notes because you're going to use those to debrief on this lesson the next period. This is an opportunity for students to speak authentically without a teacher pushing them, and you really get to observe the community dynamic, which you can debrief on the next day. For instance, some students will say nothing the entire period. Other students will have some side conversations that never get related to the entire group as a whole, despite the purpose of the assignment. The next day, I try to ask students questions like, what type of government did you end up setting up yesterday in our activity? How did it feel being an individual interacting with this society, which was your classroom? Is this survival plan going to work? What would have allowed you to create a stronger system? And you can choose how to debrief these questions however you want. Give them at the end of the period for students to reflect on for homework and be prepared for a discussion the next day, or give them at the beginning of the next day's class. Give them some time to reflect individually and then share with everybody. You can do think, pair, share, however you want to mesh it out. I love this assignment because students often will ask me afterwards, can we do that again or something like that again? And it gives us such a great frame of reference to always go back to when I'm teaching a text like Animal Farm or Persepolis. We have to think about when our society rebels against the current government structures, how do we know the new structure is going to be better? It begets the question, how do we set up a government from chaos? From a group of people who just find themselves together without any intention of having come together. And it also gives you the opportunity to discuss how the United States' government was formed in comparison to whichever text you are studying at that time. Number 4, grammar grabbers. For this activity, I tried to make grammar fun, or at least as engaging as I could. I really challenged myself to think, how could I add a kinesthetic approach to teaching grammar? I like to go over structures that teach comma placement. For that reason, I like to teach complex sentences that include subordinating conjunctions. But I thought to myself, I cannot walk into a classroom and use the phrase subordinating conjunction. I will have lost them for the whole year. So what I do is I take these words that I've cut, laminated, and put magnetic tape on the back, and I put them in my classroom on anything magnetic. These are my subordinating conjunctions. I hide these right before class begins. As students walk in, I say nothing. Once I'm ready, I tell the whole class, there are words hidden all over this room. See how many you can find. Students get up, they look around the room, and I try to tell each person to find at least one. Some students are happy to just grab the one under their seat, and others are running around the room trying to find as many as possible. Regardless of how they find their words, my hope is not for them to memorize every single one in the room. My hope is that by picking one or two, they might be able to remember that one and then be able to identify other words that function in a similar way. When they return to their desk, I have them start a sentence with the word or phrase that they found. We then read them out loud and we talk about the pause that we naturally hear in the sentence, and that dives us into a more formal lesson on complex sentences. Finally, I have students at the end of class bring up their words and put them on the front board. I usually ask somebody with fancy handwriting to write subordinating conjunctions at the top, but I'll oftentimes just use the phrase like dependent words when I refer to these in class. Having these on the board is a perfect way to reference a list from a fun activity. When students integrate these into their writing, I can then point to the board and say, hey, follow the formula. If you're like me and you teach in a school where another teacher is in your classroom right before you, you can still do this activity. I usually will grab 2 students, the first 2 to walk in my room, and ask one to help me hide the words, and I'll ask the other student to stand guard at the door. This way, my class will form a line right outside my classroom, and I have a student representative if another teacher or administrator asks what's going on to say, oh, Miss Benet is just setting up the room for an activity. And if you're teaching classes back to back, you can have your students at the end of the period hide all the words in the classroom again for the next class to go find. And voila! Number 3, Marxism Simulation. We're getting into my super favorites here. I usually do this activity when I teach a text like Animal Farm or Persepolis. When I teach those texts, I have to explain to students the difference between communism and capitalism. This is another time I tried to challenge myself by asking, how can I teach students to learn a concept by experiencing it? First, I do show an introductory video that explains these key terms, and students take notes on capitalism, communism, bourgeoisie, and proletariat. Next, I break my classroom into 2 groups, and I tell everybody to pretend that they're working in a t-shirt factory. I give them an outline of a t-shirt, and I set a timer for 1 minute. They design their t-shirts, and then when the timer goes off, I pay everybody out. We're talking about economic systems, so money must be involved. Here's the fun part. You can choose how to pay students out. You can use tickets, tokens, homework passes, candy if you're allowed to do so with allergy concerns. So one group is the communism group and one group is the capitalism group, but I don't tell them that. I start always by paying out the communism group first. I give everybody 2 tokens. In the capitalism group, I pay everyone out with 1 token until I get to the last person, and I usually give them about 8 or 10 tokens. And I go really slowly so the students have no idea how long I'm going to keep going. And while I'm paying this last person out, the students watch me and exclaim, oh my goodness, how many is she going to give this person? Afterwards, I put those terms that we took notes on back on the board, and I asked my students to explain these concepts. Which group is communism? Which group is capitalism? In the capitalist group, who's the bourgeoisie? Who's the proletariat? When I do this activity with my students, they get really into it. I'll oftentimes have a student say, oh, that person who got 10 Hershey Kisses is the bourgeoisie. They were getting all the profits. As we continue reading Persepolis or Animal Farm, I oftentimes refer back to this activity for clarification. When students are wondering what communism is, I remind them, hey, remember, if you were in the group that everybody got 2 Hershey Kisses, you were in the communist group. Everyone was equal. And students oftentimes will immediately remember which group is which. This helps students have a frame of reference to understand these complex concepts. I'll even give students time to think about, well, which group did you prefer? Why? Which system do you think this character in our book prefers, and why? Why are they proposing communism as a solution to their problems? Number 2, speed dating speeches. This is a lesson that I observed from my mentor teacher when I was an intern, and more teachers need to be doing this if they haven't heard of it before. For this assignment, students will write a speech on a famous individual, but what makes this assignment more dynamic is the way they're going to deliver their speech. Instead of having the student come to the front of the class and present in front of everyone, this activity takes speeches to the next level. On presentation day, students usually prepare a visual aid along with their speech. I divide the class into two groups, and the presenting group forms a circle around the perimeter of the classroom. They set up their poster and stand next to it. The second group of students will find someone to stand in front of. So now we have a presenter and an audience member. It's usually about a 1-to-1 ratio, or maybe up to 1 to 3 audience members if you have some students who came to class that day unprepared to give their speech. I then have students give their speeches in speed dating format. I set a timer for about 3 minutes, and when the timer goes off, the audience members rotate to the next presenter. This means that within one class period, each student will give their speech about 5 times. Halfway through class, we swap. That outer circle will then become the audience, and the audience members will become the presenters, and we do it all over again. If needed, you can always divide those two groups between 2 class periods too. As audience members are rotating, they can take notes on a sheet that you've prepared, and they can take notes on content, or they can take notes on positive things the presenters are doing with their presentation, whatever standards you are trying to hit with this activity. Why I love this activity? Students are usually so uncomfortable with speaking, and it's usually because they just don't have a lot of practice with it. This assignment really swaps out the idea of how to give a speech and gives students that practice that they really need and benefit from. This assignment is wonderful because it gives students that time to practice their speech multiple times in front of a live audience, and it's much more meaningful and beneficial than had they only given that speech one time in front of the whole class. And finally, my favorite interactive lesson, the Shakespeare Museum. Every year I was trying to find a more interactive way to have students learn background about Shakespeare. I wanted to give them the opportunity to practice some research skills, but it oftentimes became the boring PowerPoint or Google Slides presentation. Again, I wanted students to experience something more immersive. So we put on a Shakespeare Museum. Of course, this museum can apply to any content that you're doing, whether it's teaching the Holocaust with a text like Night or the Diary of Anne Frank, or even something that requires a lot of background information about religion like Life of Pi. It could apply to any time period you need to cover, such as the 20s for the Great Gatsby, or the Harlem Renaissance, or World War II. How it works. I divide the class into several groups, and each group picks a different Shakespeare topic. I give each group some guiding points that I want them to address so the audience member can understand the information that's important from their station. Students work in a group and they need to research information about their topic and develop a museum station. The requirements for their presentations include a mixture of visual, interactive, and digital displays. For instance, with digital media, one group of students created audio recordings with each student pretending to be a different scholar, talking about who really wrote Shakespeare's plays. Each student or scholar presented a different theory. Another group used our Chromebooks with the touchpad capability to create a very lifelike museum feel. Students could even click on links in the presentation that would take them to different information and slides on Shakespeare's home life versus where he had lived throughout his life. And students also make physical artifacts that audience members can actually touch when visiting their station. One group brought in a Renaissance dress that they had borrowed from the choir teacher to represent dress during that time period. Students will oftentimes create color-coded flags that represent the different genres Shakespeare wrote in: comedies, tragedies, histories. Other students have created replicas of the currency used in Shakespeare's time and the amount of money required to go see one of his plays. Students have made games with iambic pentameter to test, are you getting your accent placement correct? And then on presentation day, I give students 10 minutes to set up their station. They can put the desks in whatever arrangement they want, whether it's a table, a group, or sometimes students will take a wall of the classroom and set the desks up in a nice little row. And then the students rotate from station to station. They take notes on what they need to learn from each station. And if we don't have enough time to do all stations in one day, I'll usually set 3 groups to go on the first day and 3 groups to go on the second day. Regardless of how you do it, on presentation day, you feel that immersion in Shakespeare's world. It's a lot of fun to have students learning through movement by looking at each other's work and looking at physical and digital displays that have required so much creativity on the part of the student. Thank you for watching. I want to know what your favorite interactive lessons are, so share them in the comments below or use the hashtag #IlluminateLearning to share on Twitter and Instagram. Remember to click that subscribe button and see you next time.